Hi, and welcome to Knit Matters. This is season 4, episode 1. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm delighted that you're here. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm a fibre artist. I'm a knitting educator. I'm a Craft Yarn Council certified instructor, and I used to be a yarn store owner many years ago. I loved being a yarn store owner. I love teaching people how to knit. I love even more perhaps teaching people how to knit now. On a personal note, I want to thank you all for your kind messages and good wishes while I was sort of off screen. They really did mean a lot to me. And it's wonderful to be back again. So during my downtime, I worked on several projects, some of which are not yet finished, one of which was socks. And it's a long time since I last made socks. Those examples are long gone. So I thought I'd approach it from the perspective of a newbie knitter, or somebody that is a good knitter but hasn't done socks either ever or in a long time, like me. Anyway, I'm going to switch to the desktop camera now. So this is a sock. It doesn't look very much like a sock, but it is one. It looks better when the foot's in it, actually. This is one of a pair of socks that I've done. It would benefit from a bit of blocking, but anyway, here it is. But what freaks people out is with socks is that it seems to be like there's an awful lot to do. But let's just break it down. Essentially, you've got the cuff, you've got the leg, you've got the instep, you've got the heel, you've got the sole, and you've got the toe. There's various ways to do the different parts of the sock, and you've probably worked all those elements in other things. But it's just you're putting them all together in a relatively small item, and it tends to sort of be a bit intimidating. So let's just look at a couple of things about socks. They're nearly always knitted in the round on some form of circular needle or DPNs. They're knitted top down, cuff to toe, or toe up, toe to cuff. And there are merits and benefits to both methods. These are top down. One of the things with socks is that you need a firm knitted fabric. Most sock patterns are designed with negative ease. That is to say that they are the same size, if you like, as the body part. So they're going to be the same measurement as the foot rather than having any ease. Because in a sock, you want a snug fit. You don't want a loose fit. You don't want it moving around, especially if you're wearing a shoe of some kind. It's going to be really uncomfortable. You want it to fit snugly. So negative ease means you're going to stretch it to put it on, which is what you want. So it's important to achieve the right gauge, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Now you can use DPNs, double pointed needles, you can use 2 circulars, or you can use the magic loop method on a single circular. If you want a refresher for magic loop and 2 circulars, go to season 2, episode 15 on our Knit Matters YouTube channel. You'll find them there. Or there is a type of flexi needle, which I was using, and it's somewhere else now. Anyway, the flexi needle is basically it's almost like, it's either a very short circular with a tiny cable in between, or sort of 2 DPNs joined in the middle. But it's I quite like those, actually. It means you have less needles to worry about. Anyway, whatever you choose, you need to stick to the same method for both socks, because I did an experiment. I didn't check my gauge. What? I didn't check my gauge? I always check my gauge, but I intentionally did not do that this time. Now, my first sock I did on DPNs, which if you've seen Knit Matters before, you'll know I'm not a lover of DPNs. The needles that I used were much finer than this. They were a very nice needle, but they were actually too long. They were about 7.5 inches long. And I found that too long, there was just too much needle and too little knitting for my liking. So I switched to doing the magic loop on my second sock. I did my first sock on DPNs, and I did the second one on a circular, 32-inch circular, and used the magic loop method. And when I'd finished them, they were different sizes. My gauge actually gave me a snugger fit with the magic loop, probably because I was more used to using a magic loop method and I was more comfortable with that. But there was actually a 1/4 inch difference in the width of the leg and a 3/8 inch difference in the foot width. Now that's pretty significant for socks. I can't actually show you that one because I unraveled it so that I would make the third and final one in the same way that I made the first one. Otherwise I wouldn't have had enough yarn. So the lesson there is, although I did that as a deliberate experiment, do check your gauge and do whatever method works best for you, stick to that for both socks. If you do need to change your knitting method or the needles that you're using between socks, do make sure the gauge is the same. Work it so that your gauge comes out the same. Otherwise you'll end up with 2 different size socks as I did. Now this pattern is from a book by a lady called Rachel Coopy. It's called, the book is Coop Knits. She calls it Socks, yeah. She's done some really funky socks in here, and it's a really nice book. If you're keen on making socks, it's a good one. There's some really easy patterns and more complex one, and they're really fun to do. Anyway, that was where I got this sock pattern from. Now, whether you're doing the toe up or cuff down sock, at some point a sock needs a heel, and that's often the bit that freaks people out. And it really doesn't need to, because the heel is simply a cupped shape piece of knitted fabric, and there, like everything else, there's more than one way to do that heel. Now one option is the Afterthought heel, and in truth this is actually a Forethought heel, because when we knit it, we're creating a placeholder for the heel while we're knitting the sock and then going back to it later. So we actually know where we're going to put the heel in a Forethought heel. It's also referred to as a peasant heel because it can be replaced quite easily when that's worn out, and heels tend to wear out quite quickly. So you could unpick all that and do another heel if you wanted to. So basically when we're doing an Afterthought, or in this case a Forethought heel, those words are sort of interchangeable, but if we really want to be pedantic, a true Afterthought heel is done after the sock is completed, when you actually don't know where you want your heel, and we'll do that in the next episode. So this is the other sock, and I've just folded it so that you can see that it is really a complete tube. It's got a cuff and a toe and a sock, it's a tube sock, and then the heel is done afterwards. Now if I sort of squidge this up, you can kind of see where I did my placement for my heel, sort of in there. So a Forethought heel is quite handy when you're trying to, if you don't want to break up the pattern, or you want to do it after a set of stripes, or there's a particular design element that you want to work in. It's quite useful because you can place your heel exactly where you want it to. So, and of course if your length difference, one thing I should say is if the length of the sock in the pattern differs from the foot that you're making it for, you can alter it by knitting a few more rows or a few less rows. It's a tube. You can really play about with that if you want to. So now I'm going to show you how to set up this heel and do this Afterthought heel. So here's my little sock sample, as it were. I know it hasn't got a cuff and a toe, but it's a tube. That's what we're working on. So you can see here that I've marked the placement of where I want my heel. What you're going to need, and I'm going to take you through how to do this in a second, but let's just look what I've done. What you're going to need for doing this, you're going to need some contrast colour waste yarn of the same thickness of the sock that you're knitting. In this case, this is a bit of double knitting. Generally, I'm knitting socks on a much finer yarn, but for the purpose of demonstration, it's just easier showing you on some double knit. So I've got some other double knit there in a different colour. You can see perhaps that pale yellow there. Then what I've done here, I've got lifelines here before the waste yarn and after the waste yarn. Now, I've talked about lifelines before. Generally, you use them to sort of save a piece of knitting. So if you're doing a very complicated pattern, particularly with lace, you put in a lifeline sort of every few inches or maybe every pattern repeat, and you do it sort of while you're knitting that particular row, or you can run it in afterwards. And then if you make a major mistake and you have to rip back, you don't have to rip all the knitting out, you just go back to the last lifeline. So that's why they call them lifelines, because they save your knitting life and your sanity too. So I've got 2 lifelines here. I put them in, one before I did the waste yarn and then the second one afterwards. You're going to need your contrast colour waste yarn, the same weight as that working yarn. You're going to need, bizarrely, some dental floss, or, don't have to use dental floss, or a thinner yarn in a contrast colour. This is the yarn that I use to make my stripy socks, and it's much thinner, much finer than the double knit, so that would do just fine. But if I didn't have a finer yarn, I could just as easily use dental floss. And you're going to need a tapestry needle. So let me show you what I've done here. So I've got to the point on this little sample where I'm about to do my placement for my heel. So before I do that, I want to put in my lifeline, and all I'm going to do is just go through the the center of the stitch. You might actually benefit if you are doing it as a magic loop. It's actually a bit easier to slide the work down onto the cable. Then you can get your needle, your tapestry needle, in fairly, nice and freely, so you're not snagging the yarn. You don't want to catch the yarn in particularly. It's not the end of the world if you do, but it's much harder to get the lifeline out, obviously, if you've caught it with the needle. So you're just going to go along there, and you don't want your lifeline so long that you're going to catch it on everything, but by the same token, you don't want it so short that you can't hang on to it. So there's my lifeline in there. Can't see it too well in against the red needle, but you will in a minute. So I've got my lifeline in there, in the bright pink, which you'll see in a minute. Now I'm going to slide those stitches back on because I'm going to knit my waste yarn. You don't have to fasten this waste yarn off in any way. You just are going to, it's just going to sort of sit there freely. But I'm going to knit with it for one row. If I can untangle myself. Now, when you're knitting this, you want to be careful that you don't knit the lifeline in, because again, you're going to remove it in a minute, and it's going to be really hard to do if you do. So just bear with me as I knit along here, making sure that I don't catch my lifeline. And as I say, you don't have to fasten off your waste yarn. I nearly said waistline then. Waste yarn. So I'm just going to knit along this line here of stitches. And usually when you're doing an afterthought or a forethought heel, you're going to be using half the number of stitches that you cast on for your sock. This is obviously a demonstration piece, so I've got 32 stitches on my needle, and I'm using 16 stitches. So now you can see that pink yarn there, and there's my waste yarn. Now what I'm going to do is slide these same stitches, the ones that I've just knitted, back onto my left needle. I'm doing magic loop. If you were doing it on DPNs or at 2 circulars, you just slide it back to the left hand needle. So I'm going to slide these back onto this needle here. Here we go. I can hear a train in the background. Okay, so they're back onto my circular there. Just make sure I'm not going to pull that out, and make sure I don't pull out. For safety's sake, I'm just going to tuck those into my tube of knitting there so I don't snag them. Okay. Actually, I don't need to take the lifelines in, but I will just tuck the yellow in. Right, now what I'm going to do with my main yarn, that wasn't very clever tucking those in, they've caught on around my main yarn. So maybe I won't tuck them into the tube. Anyway, my blue is what I'm knitting next, my light blue here. So get all these yarns out of the way and I'll show you what I'm doing. I did my lifeline, my waste yarn, I slid the waste yarn back onto what is my left needle, the one I'm going to knit with. Now I'm going to knit across those stitches that I've just done using my the colour, my next colour stripe. Okay, so I'm going to just hang on to that yellow end there. I don't want that to get too flappy. And I'm going to knit along all those stitches. That I've just done. There's the train again. Okay. Okay. So what I would do next is do another lifeline. I won't do the whole thing on this one, and I'll go back to my sample, but I would just go along here. Again, easier if I put it on the cable. Go along. Right through the centre of the stitch. There we go. That's my second lifeline in. Okay, right there. So if I go back to the sample here, you can see it a bit better on this one. And then I would just continue my knitting. I would just continue knitting in the round until I'd got my length of sock where I wanted it. So the next bit that we have to do, once we've done all that, once I've completed my sock, just imagine that my toe is on and I'm ready to do my heel. Now I need to get the stitches off the lifelines onto the needles, or rather I need to take, and yes, I do need to do that, but first I need to take the waste yarn out. So to do that, and this is where you need to take your time, this is where your lifelines come into their own. So what you want to do is just carefully start pulling that out. And you can, it's always a bit scary this bit, you can snip the yarn, your waste yarn, along as you go, if it makes it easier. It's a bit terrifying when you first do this, but your stitches are held quite happily by those lifelines. And you're going to go along the whole, there's my lifelines there. You're going to go along, I'm going to snip this as I go, as I don't want to pull out the stitches, I want to unpick them. Okay. And so on and so on and so on. As long as your lifelines are in there, nothing's gonna go wrong. You're not gonna lose them. Okay. So, got to the end almost. Now the next thing we need to do, once we've done this, there we go. There we go. Now that's a bit scary looking. That's the bit that well, makes us freak out a little bit. We're not used to seeing our knitting looking like that. Now I would say, if you are going to leave your work at this point and come back to it another time, I would just recommend that you very loosely tie the lifeline ends at each end. Because the last thing you want is to put it in your knitting bag or put it to one side and then grab it out again, find you caught the lifelines, and now you have live stitches like a gap mouth, and they're all over the place. That's not what you want. Sorry, lost the picture there for a moment. So once you're at this stage, if you leave it, just tie those together, so it's for safety's sake. So now what we have to do is pick up these live stitches. And this really isn't that difficult. So I'm going to show you on this one, and then I'm going to sort of switch to a sample that I've already done, just to say for the sake of time. So I would recommend that you do this on a flat, firm surface. It's much easier if you do that. You have a bit more control and you can see where your stitches are. I'm going to be picking this up so you can see it better, but if you're doing it, I would recommend you do it on a table or a board or something, rather than just doing it on your lap. It's much easier to do it when you can control it better. So what we're going to do is just pick up those stitches right through the center. Again, careful you don't stab your lifelines. And there we go. Now that's all you do. You keep going across the end to the end of your row. When you get to the last one, it can be a little tricky, so use your lifeline to help you and just sort of lift it up. Get it on the needle. Now you can take out your lifeline. There we go. All right. And now you need to pick up the other side. So we're going to turn the work around and do exactly the same thing. Doesn't matter if your lifeline is sort of behind your stitch or in front of them, as long as you're not catching that as you go. If you find it a bit difficult, use a smaller needle to pick them up and then transfer your stitches to the size that you're using. Mind you, if you're making socks, they're usually on quite small needles anyway, so you may not have a smaller size particularly. But it can be done. You may have to just push those along a bit. It's funny how that lifeline takes up the space of the stitch. Okay, see here, I need to pick that one up a bit because it wants to disappear into the stitch below it, and then finally my last one. Okay, now you can take out the second lifeline. Then all I would do is, if I'm using DP ends, I'm going to divide my stitches into half, equal amounts, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right. now you're going to be ready to start working your heel in the way that your pattern says. The other thing that you would do, and we will go over that next, we will do that next week when we do the true afterthought heel. One of the things that you need to do, because the nature of this forethought heel or afterthought heel, once you get to this stage, you're actually working an afterthought or forethought heel. They're the same thing. The terminology just, depicts whether you've decided to place your heel or whether you don't know where you want it. But after that, the construction is the same. But one of the things that this construction suffers with is you can get gappiness here at either side. In the Rachel Coopy pattern, what she has us do is pick up 2 stitches on either side there, and then the following round or the following other rounds, you then decrease. There's different ways to decrease depending on the shape of the heel, and we'll talk about, I'll show you how to do that next week. I do just want to show you this starburst heel, which is rather pretty. So once I had separated my instep from the sole and put in my heel, I think for this size, the next round was decreasing there and decreasing there, the extra stitches, and then it was knitting a few plain rows without shaping, and then the shaping started, and it was simply a case of, again, depending on the size that you were doing, you're doing a knit 2 together decrease and a certain number of stitches at intervals, so you get this rather nice sort of starburst heel. But next week I'll show you how to do a shaped heel that is more like this, almost slightly rounder shape, but you're going to be shaping at those sides there, and there's a special treatment that we can use to minimize the holes that seem to always develop there. Very simple but very effective. In this one, when I did this one, I just did as the pattern instructed me. There were some holes, but because I had yarn ends of different colors, I tightened those holes up as I wove in my ends. But if you're going to do that, you need to keep it nice and flat, because the last thing you want is knots and bumps where it's going to go against your foot. So that was our forethought heel. I hope that took a bit of, I should come back to you. And it's a while since I've done this and I've forgotten. So I hope that took the fear out of sock heels, or at least that version of sock heels. See, it's really not that difficult, is it? It's a tube sock and you're putting a heel in. And they're all techniques that you've done before. It's just putting them together that seems alarming. So, as always, feel free to message me if you have any questions. This episode and all others will be uploaded to the Knitting Matters Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And the replays, of course, are available at any time. And if you're searching for this one and any other episode, it's Season 4, Episode 1. Thank you for joining me. Keep well, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye for now.